Drill, baby, drill. On this episode of Pushback.
Go, Jonny, go, go. Go, Jonny, go, go. Go, Jonny, go, go.
If you're concerned about the direction our culture is heading, then maybe it's time to push back.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Pushback. I'm Dr. Jonny, and I'm coming to you under a little duress this morning. I'm actually recording this early Wednesday morning. I am post-call. I was on call last night and got about 2 hours of sleep. So I've done this before. I've done sermons before and conferences before, somewhat sleep deprived, and my children love it because sometimes I say some of the most fascinating, unusual, and beautiful things when I'm sleep deprived. So we'll see how this goes this morning. And it's not an uncomplicated topic that I'm talking about, so I'm going to have to get my brain revved up to try to convey this topic to you the best that I possibly can. I was also supposed to do my taxes this morning, but because I got delayed at the ER, I missed my tax appointment. So I don't have closure on that either, which is a little bit frustrating, but they'll get done. Taxes always have to get done, whether we like it or not. My brother, Mark, sent me a text that said intoxication. He gave me the definition of the word intoxication. And the definition went something like this. It's the euphoria you feel when you realize you're getting a tax return, only then to realize that it was your money in the first place. Intoxication. So that's what I'm doing this week. It's been an interesting week, but we're going to get through it. And I have an important topic, an interesting topic that I've been learning about that really, I believe, brings my last several podcasts kind of full circle, because I talked about global warming, I talked about Vladimir Putin, I talked about gas prices and the role that we actually get to play in world politics with the war in Russia and Ukraine. But today I really want to talk even more specifically, as I mentioned last week, about oil itself, because at the heart of a lot of these topics are money and oil. And I want to really dig into this topic the best that I can as a layperson, as a physician, not a geopolitical expert. But I mentioned at the end of my podcast on climate change this paragraph, and I'm just going to start with this. Many of the measures that climate change alarmists propose, such as drastic changes in energy uses, will have far-reaching effects on the less fortunate. It is therefore vital that we examine the worldview based on assumptions behind the interpretation of climate change before we make decisions about human behavior. And this has become really forefront of this whole discussion with the war in Ukraine, as well as climate change, as well as economy and the budget. Because before talking about climate change, I talked about the national debt. And all of these things are going to be tied in together with this podcast. So before I jump into that, I just want to, and I don't want to insult you with stating the obvious, but I want to talk about the ways to increase money in government. How can the government get more money to do the things that the government wants to do? Well, there really is four ways of doing that, in my opinion. One is to increase taxes. We just talked about intoxication. Increase taxes. They can take more of our money to accomplish what they need to do. Sometimes you increase taxes by improving the economy, because as people make more money, the more taxes they actually pay. So that makes sense. Number two is they can borrow money. And as my discussion went with, of course, the national debt, we've been doing plenty of that to the tune of somewhere around $30 trillion. So we can borrow money as through the U.S. treasuries. Interestingly, I looked up the foreign governments who have purchased U.S. treasuries to which we are indebted. And number one is China. There's also Japan, Brazil, Ireland, and the UK, and others. China represents 29% of all treasuries, which corresponds to 1.18 trillion. Japan is very close, and actually some websites I saw has Japan even ahead of China at 1.03 trillion in treasuries. Now, sometimes these countries invest in our treasuries because their economy is shaky, and so we don't need to necessarily be alarmed by that. However, the reason we're selling treasuries is because we have an unbalanced budget, and we are going more and more in debt and not spending appropriately. A third way we can do it is to print new money. There's been a lot of talk about that lately, and President Biden has not been shy about doing that. The more money is printed, however, the less it is worth. And that is called inflation. That is what we're seeing. There's a fourth way, which is one that doesn't seem to always be entertained, but you can actually decrease spending. Wow. You actually decrease what you spend, and at the end of the day, you're going to have more money. So I'm happy to report that after my last podcast, I'm sure it was because President Biden listened to my podcast, that he announced a ban on all imports in Russian oil, gas, and energy to the United States, targeting the, quote, main artery of Russia's economy amid Putin's war on Ukraine. There's an interesting paragraph I just want to read to you. It says, in short, the question of whether to ban Russian oil imports has placed the White House in an unenviable position. It has to somehow balance strategic, moral, economic, and political concerns. But there is another sense in which the Russian invasion has greatly clarified the choices facing us as a country and presented us with a historic opportunity to make the United States less beholden to a diminishing stock of fossil fuels and the autocratic governments that control much of it. So it's an interesting paragraph because I agree 100% that this has clarified choices for us. And that's why I started with the 4 ways that the government can increase money, because I'm going to come back to that at the end in context of oil and what is happening here in our country today. So President Biden was quoted, and I'm quoting this directly off of his, I believe, his Twitter account, that he wrote, "This is a stark reminder," referring to the oil crisis. "To protect our economy over the long term, we need to become energy independent. And it should motivate us to accelerate our transition to a clean energy future." Contrast to that to former President Trump, who also has been quoted this week in response to what President Biden just said. He said he is, quote, "letting the radical climate extremists run our country while the world burns," as gas prices in the U.S. surged to record highs amid Russia's war against Ukraine. President Trump goes on to say, quote, "We have the oil under our feet, liquid gold," Trump said, "but instead we are thinking of buying oil from Venezuela, Iran, and others who do not exactly love America." Trump added, "Bring back American energy independence and American dominance." I think this is quite telling because both the current president and the former president has actually said they want energy independence. It's in both of their quotes. And here, the defining conversation begins. I believe what has happened between Russia and Ukraine has absolutely clarified the choices facing us as a country, as I just read. Because President Biden is calling for energy independence and former President Trump is calling for energy independence. But I believe that they have 2 different ways that they want to achieve that. So President Biden is saying that this crisis should motivate us. The high prices that actually the Biden administration has caused should actually motivate us to accelerate our transition to a clean energy future. Putin's war is already hurting American families at the gas pump since Putin began his military buildup on Ukrainian borders, Biden warned. And with this action, it's going to go up further. I'm going to do everything I can to minimize Putin's price hike here at home in coordination with our partners. But Biden has made it very clear that Russia is to blame. In fact, he has coined this as hashtag Putin price hike. Putin price hike, as they're trying to divert blame onto the Russian Tsar. So many have said to combat this shocking price increase, many have echoed White House talking points, lecturing Americans to buy more electric cars. And other liberal pundits have insisted that Americans should simply eliminate oil dependence altogether without offering a viable alternative. And here becomes the problem. I'm quoting a man named Hauk from Fox News. He said, it's not just tone deaf, but demeaning and insulting for them to almost celebrate the lack of adequate oil supply and the sky-high prices at the pump. Contrary to their, again, worldview, working men and women weren't able to have the funds to boot the bill for a Tesla or an electric car or an accountant to find them the massive tax breaks. No matter what they say, viewers will see right through these smug pleas to go green. This has been a recurrent frustration as we see the Democrats and the liberal left actually pushing or actually claiming that these gas high prices are the motivating factors, the things that should push us into a green energy future. The conversations on MSNBC came after Secretary Pete Buttigieg on Monday said that the American people stand to benefit from having more electric vehicles on the road, but failed to elaborate on how they can become more affordable. Buttigieg remarked that Americans from rural to suburban to urban communities can all benefit from the gas savings of driving an EV. Although the cost of electric vehicles have come down in recent years, they still remain out of reach for millions of Americans, with an average price hovering around $50,000. And this, my friends, is the problem with this line of thinking, with this worldview of transitioning to green energy, is the fact that it's not affordable. There is no way to actually implement this plan under the current structure because there aren't the funds to actually make it a reality. And so the government, the left wing of the government is actually pushing for this, actually seeing an opportunity, actually seizing an opportunity with the high gas prices to actually tout this idea that this is our opportunity to go green. This is the calling card. This should motivate us. Cornell Law School professor William Jacobson reported that he feels that the green agenda is, quote, danger to our national security itself. Maybe decades from now, we will have the technology to replace fossil fuels, but until then, it is reckless to leave ourselves vulnerable. The green agenda is also elitist, ignoring the costs imposed on working class people from higher gasoline and heating sources. And this is where we have the rub. If we could all snap our fingers and have a cost-effective, affordable green energy supply at our fingertips, then maybe we would all be for it. But not only is it based and predicated on a very wishy-washy scientific backbone, but it also is an unaffordable, unattainable a source of energy to us at this point, that it makes it completely out of reach. It makes it a fairy tale. Senator Mike Crapo, U.S. Senator Mike Crapo, I just want to read his report because I think this really sums it up well in my heart in this, and ties in the whole Ukrainian-Russian connection to this as well. He reports that more than a third of Vladimir Putin's budget comes from the sale of Russian oil and natural gas. Congress must target that and more to hold Putin accountable long-term for his unacceptable aggression against the Ukrainian people. In addition to banning Russian energy imports, we must revoke favorable trade relations with Russia and Belarus and provide the president authority to raise tariffs on the other nearly half of imports that Russia sells to the United States. Putin cannot enjoy the same trade status as their NATO allies and other international partners. Instead, Russia belongs in the same pariah trade status as North Korea and Cuba. That is only half the equation, however. As inflation and gas prices skyrocket to new highs, it is time for President Biden to change his mind on other issues that empowers Vladimir Putin: domestic energy production. And I would say not only change his mind, but change his world view. Rather than ask Venezuela and OPEC to increase production, American oil and gas production must replace Russian energy imports so that we have more jobs, stable energy prices, and the ability to support our allies' energy needs instead of leaving them at Putin's mercy. Despite attempts to blame rising energy prices on efforts to punish Russia for its premeditated attacks, the skyrocketing cost of gas in Idaho and across the nation have been more than a year in making. This is way before the Russian and Ukrainian conflict. And these next 3 sentences are very important from Senator Crapo. Just 3 years ago, he writes, under Republican leadership, the United States had become a net oil exporter for the first time since World War II. Within hours of taking office, President Biden started his campaign against domestic energy production by canceling the Keystone Pipeline. A week later, he ordered the Department of Interior to, quote, pause new oil and natural gas leases on public lands or in offshore waters, end quote. Well, not surprisingly, a year into his administration, gas prices for Americans rose 40%. Oil imports increased, and traditional energy producers at home have faced extensive attacks, while the administration encourages Iran, a state sponsor of terror, and Venezuela, a brutal communist regime, to produce more. Senator Crapo says, enough. Unleash American oil and gas production to replace not only Russian imports and help stabilize prices at the pump, but to facilitate exports to support our allies and end their dependence on Russia. It means jobs at home, stronger allies, and a weaker Putin. I'm going to echo Senator Crapo's note by saying I also say enough. This actually makes me somewhat angry because I feel manipulated. I feel like there is just such a spirit of politicization that has taken place with this. I believe I've been manipulated by crisis and by money. This is taking an oil crisis, taking a humanitarian crisis, and taking it to your advantage and trying to twist it and to try to, quote, motivate us to transition into green energy. I believe that's missing the point completely. This is just not good economics. We are just simply not there yet. I believe, and maybe this is another podcast for another day, I believe there's even a greater reason. I'm not a big conspiracy theory guy, but I believe there is even a bigger reason, maybe an energy takeover by the government. A sinister role at play here that's trying to get its tentacles into what can be a private sector position and take it so that the government gets more control over the energy grid in our country. And the best way of doing that is by actually creating an energy resource that requires the government not only to motivate it, but to fund it. And this is what's going to bring us back to our budget crisis that I talked about at the very beginning. See, my friend, this is not good economics. I mentioned before that I have a wind turbine. I'm all about going green in the sense of taking care of our planet. I believe that we are all stewards and should take care of our resources. I have a residential wind turbine, and I actually installed a geothermal system to heat our home. I can testify to you that neither of those have been a very good economic investment. Has it been good for the environment? I think I can make the case that it has, but I got a U.S. grant to help pay and to subsidize some of the cost of the wind turbine. Guess where that money came from? It came from the taxpayers. And yet, here I am about 13 to 14 years into the wind turbine project, and I don't think there's really any hope that it's ever going to pay for itself. Wind turbines have about a 20-year lifespan. I hope that mine lasts that long, but I'm still going to probably be under by thousands of dollars on this project. Same with the geothermal. There's just a lot of repairs and a lot of problems that have happened with it and how it works. And because of that, I just don't feel like it's been a good investment. And so the residential green energy sector is actually dying. The residential wind turbine sector is almost completely gone. The company that made my wind turbine is no longer in business. And I know that President Trump has talked many times about green energy, solar and wind. These gigantic wind turbine farms that we see, they also have about a 20-year lifespan. What happens after 20 years? What are we doing with the old, rusted, broken down wind turbines? Putting them in a landfill? My friends, this isn't sustainable either, and it's not a good investment in our money. So here we are in this budget crisis, and there's only these 4 ways that the government can actually create more money. One is to increase taxes. I found the craziest article this morning when I was looking on the internet, and it's entitled "Democrats Unveil Plan for New Quarterly Stimulus Checks." Like, you can't even make this up. This is like a shell game in its true sense. It actually makes me angry. So what the Democrats are proposing is that they would put a new tax on large oil companies. The tax would equal about 50% of the difference between what a barrel of oil costs today and the average price of a barrel of oil between 2015 and 2019. And the money collected then would fund stimulus payments to help people pay for their gas bill. Like, you can't even make it up. Do you see the circular insanity of this argument? Of course, it's co-sponsored by Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Let's tax the oil companies. Let's take some of that money. Let's give it to the people to help pay for the gas, which is going to actually hurt the gas companies. And then guess what they're going to do? They're going to raise their gas prices. You can't even make it up. It's a political shell game that's happening, all based on an attempt to try to hurt, to cripple the oil companies. So they can increase taxes, they can give stimulus checks, they can borrow more money. And I think that every debate here going forward needs to be focused on borrowing money from China. In order to have EV vehicles, we have to have charging stations implemented all throughout our country. And I've heard recently that each car company has like a different plug. It's the most insane thing I've ever heard. And I've heard that people have to wait 1 to 2 hours at these charging stations to get their car recharged. My friends, guess who's paying for all of these charging stations? It's the government subsidizing these. It's the government subsidizing the purchase of an EV vehicle. Where is all that money coming from? It's coming from us and from our taxes. And the only way that they're going to be able to pay for it is to increase taxes or to borrow it from China. Do we want to borrow money from China to put in EV plugs all throughout our country? I believe the answer is no. They can print more money. They could also try to reduce spending. Actually, I think that we do need to reduce our usage of oil in our country. We're the main producer, but we're also the main utilizer, even though we don't have the biggest population. We're an affluent country and we use a lot of oil. And I believe that every family can look in the mirror and maybe find ways to decrease production. But we are the number one producer, the number one consumer of oil. And as Senator Crapo said, we are actually the ones who actually became exporters of oil just a few years ago under Republican leadership. See, that's sleep deprivation talking right there. Under Republican leadership. So my answer, President Trump's answer, the Republican senator's answer is drill, baby, drill. Drill, baby, drill became a phrase at the Republican convention because we have oil under our feet. We can produce, we can become energy independent that both presidents are looking for by just increasing oil production domestically. It's a low-cost fuel. The infrastructure is already there to distribute it to all Americans. It creates jobs. We don't have to borrow money to do it. There's no dependence on dictators if we don't need their oil. We can reduce consumption so that we have more than enough oil to meet our needs. We have no diminishing stock. We have plenty. We can become energy independent by just tapping in. We can do this being sensitive to the climate. We've done it for years. We haven't done it perfectly, but I believe we can do better, and we can research how we can do that better. Even Barack Obama touted the surge in fracking that occurred on his watch, which brought down global prices, to the ire of climate activists. Even Barack Obama realized the importance of drilling to help our economy, to move things forward. See, this is so important that we know how to talk about this, that we don't just get angry about gas prices and we just don't yell at Joe Biden, but that we understand why his worldview is actually misleading us. I want to read the same paragraph that I started with. Many of the measures that climate change alarmists propose, such as drastic changes in energy uses, will have far-reaching effects on the less fortunate. It is therefore vital that we examine the worldview based on assumptions behind the interpretation of climate change, the faulty interpretation of climate change, before we make decisions about human behavior. My friends, this is about pushback. This is about listening and catching the activists in the worldview that have sinister motives and are proposing a green energy plan that is unattainable and unfinanceable. And I believe it's important that we realize that we're able to talk about it, and that we support candidates that are willing to tap into our own resources to help our own people, not only our own people, because when we do this, we help Ukrainians, we help Europeans, we help others that we can actually provide oil to at a reasonable cost so they don't have to be dependent on dictatorships. It makes sense. We just need to have our eyes open and realize how important this topic is, not only to our pocketbook, but to the economy of our country and to the world. Thank you for listening to me. I'm going to go take a nap now. I think we did okay. Hopefully this was coherent, and I appreciate your attention and time on all this. I would appreciate your feedback as well. Pushbackculture.org, pushbackculture.org to leave any questions or comments or concerns about the things that we talked about or any other insights that you might have. So before I go take a nap, let's go together now to set and shape the culture.